Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, there could be a tunnel no wider than your shoulders, filled with air you couldn't breathe for more than a minute. For over a century, hundreds of thousands of men walked into tunnels like that every single morning. And for a surprising number of them, that walk down was the last ordinary thing they ever did. This isn't a story about explosions, not really. It's a story about what happens after the explosion. When the lights go out, the air turns to poison, and the only thing left is how long a human being can hold on in the dark. Start with the numbers, because you need them, but only briefly. Mining has always been dangerous work. Rock breaks, gas leaks, water finds its way where it shouldn't. But the disasters that actually changed the world weren't just about how many people died. They were about what happened to the ones who didn't, and about the mistakes so specific, so almost accidental, that they reshaped laws, industries, and in one case, gave you your Saturday off. On the morning of March 10, 1906, in the coalfields of northern France, a routine spark inside a mine near a town called Courrières set off a chain reaction that most people, if they know it at all, remember for one number: 1,099 dead. It remains the worst mining disaster in European history. But the death toll isn't the part of this story you haven't heard. 20 days after the explosion, rescue teams had stopped looking for survivors and started looking for bodies. The air that deep underground, after 3 weeks without ventilation, should have been unbreathable. And then, on March 30th, a group of 13 miners walked out of the darkness on their own legs. They had survived for 20 days. Not by luck, but by doing things that shouldn't have been possible. In the earliest days, with no food and no way out, they stripped bark from the wooden support beams holding up the tunnel roof and ate it. When that ran out, they found a mine horse, one of the animals used to haul coal carts through the underground passages, that had died in the disaster. They ate it raw, in total darkness, because a fire would have used up what little air they had left. For water, they didn't dig or search. They simply waited and let it drip from the rock walls into their mouths, drop by drop, for 20 days. Even that wasn't the end of it. 4 days after those 13 men emerged, rescuers found one more. A single miner, Auguste Berthaud, had been sealed in an even more remote section of the mine, alone, and had somehow kept himself alive for 24 days underground before he was pulled out. 24 days. Longer than most people have ever gone without seeing daylight in their entire lives. You'd think a story like that would be the peak of the disaster. It wasn't. It was the spark for something else entirely. News of Courrières didn't just spread grief, it spread fury. Miners across the region already knew their working conditions were brutal, but the scale of the disaster, combined with stories that rescue efforts had been slow and disorganized, pushed that anger past its limit. Roughly 30,000 miners walked off the job in protest, and the unrest grew so severe that the French government deployed the military just to keep order in the coalfields. Historians studying French labor law point to this exact moment, this exact disaster, as one of the key pressures that helped push forward the country's mandatory day of rest legislation. In other words, buried inside a tragedy that killed over 1,000 men is a thread that leads eventually to the 2-day weekend you now take for granted. But there's one more detail from Courrières that almost never makes it into any retelling, and it's the one that stays with you the longest. Among the 1,099 dead were 27 boys who were orphans, some as young as 13 years old, sent to work in that mine not by ambition, but because the regional government literally could not find them employment anywhere else. They weren't miners by choice. They were placed there because society had nowhere else to put them. That's not a footnote. That's the disaster's real cost, written in the ages of the people it swallowed. If Courrières shows you what survival looks like when everything goes wrong, the next disaster shows you something different. What desperation looks like when men know exactly what's coming and still have hours, sometimes days, to think about it. In June of 1917, in Butte, Montana, a candle brushed against oil-soaked insulation deep inside the Speculator copper mine, and the resulting fire remains to this day the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in American history. Unlike coal mining disasters, which tend to dominate the history books, this one involved copper miners working over 2,000 feet underground, in a maze of tunnels so extensive that some men had no realistic path back to the surface once the smoke started spreading. What makes Speculator different is what the trapped miners did next. Knowing rescue might take hours or might never come, some crews used timber and canvas to build makeshift bulkheads, sealing themselves into small pockets of tunnel to keep the toxic smoke out, essentially entombing themselves alive on purpose, betting that a slow suffocation behind a wall was better odds than the smoke outside it. Some of those men survived behind their handmade barricades for as long as 55 hours, nearly 2.5 days, breathing recycled, shrinking air, waiting. And in that waiting, several of them wrote. Not code, not distress signals, letters, farewell notes to wives and children, written by candlelight against a timber wall in case the wait outlasted them. Some of those notes were found on bodies. Some were found on survivors, who had written their goodbyes days before they were finally pulled out alive. Speculator forces you to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a mine isn't the explosion or the fire. It's everything that happens after, in the hours a person spends deciding how they're going to face what comes next. Not every disaster comes from fire or gas, though. Sometimes the ground itself simply gives up. In January of 1960, at the Coalbrook Colliery in South Africa, there was no spark, no flame, no warning smell of gas. The mine used a system of underground pillars, essentially massive columns of coal left standing to hold up the roof of the tunnels above them. On paper, the math worked. In practice, over an enormous underground area, hundreds of those support pillars failed within moments of each other, in a cascading structural collapse that brought down a vast section of the mine roof almost simultaneously. 435 workers were killed, not by combustion, but by geology losing an argument with mathematics. The scale of the collapse was so massive that rescue operations were essentially impossible from the start. There was nothing left to dig toward. Coalbrook is the disaster most documentaries skip because it doesn't have a dramatic fireball or a rescue story. It has something quieter and, in some ways, more disturbing. The idea that an entire underground world can simply cave in on itself all at once, with no single moment you could point to and say, that's when it went wrong. Sometimes, the disaster isn't even underground when it starts. In February of 1972, in Buffalo Creek, West Virginia, a coal company had been storing the wastewater from its mining operations behind a series of 3 dams, made not from concrete or engineered stone, but essentially piled coal waste. After days of heavy rain, the first dam failed. Then, because the water from the first collapse slammed directly into the second, that one failed too. Then the third. 3 earthen dams, falling like dominoes, released a wall of black sludge and water down the narrow valley below, where mining towns had been built for generations, trusting those dams to hold. Buffalo Creek rarely gets filed under mining disaster in most people's minds because no one was underground when it happened. But the coal industry created every ounce of the material that turned into that wave. It is, in the truest sense, a mining disaster that simply chose to happen above ground, in daylight, in the middle of people's homes. If Buffalo Creek is about water breaking loose from the surface, the next disaster is about water breaking loose underneath it, and it might be the most quietly horrifying entry on this list. In December of 1975, at the Chasnala Colliery in India, there was an explosion, but the explosion itself wasn't the main killer. Directly above the active mine sat an older section that had been abandoned years earlier and had slowly filled with water over time, forming an enormous underground reservoir that no one was actively monitoring. The blast that day did something almost unthinkable. It cracked the barrier of rock and coal that had, until that moment, been the only thing separating the working mine below from that flooded, abandoned mine above. When that barrier gave way, water didn't trickle in. It poured, at an estimated rate of roughly 7 million gallons per minute, into tunnels full of men who had no possible way to outrun it. In some sections, workers had less than a minute between the sound of cracking rock and the water reaching them. The recovery afterward was its own horror. Chasnala's floodwaters were so extensive and the underground layout so complex that rescue crews couldn't safely access many of the flooded sections for weeks. When bodies were finally recovered, decomposition in some cases had gone so far that miners could only be identified by one thing: the serial number stamped onto the lamp attached to their helmet, The first body wasn't recovered until 26 days after the flood began. And even now, no one agrees on how many people actually died. The official government count sits at 372. But the local workers' union has always maintained the true number was closer to 700, pointing to the colliery's inconsistent record-keeping and the fact that an unknown number of bodies were simply never recovered from the flooded tunnels at all. Somewhere between 372 and 700 men vanished into that water, and the exact number may never be settled. There's one more disaster worth understanding, not because of its death toll, but because of the mechanism behind it, because it shows you exactly how a survivable accident turns into a mass casualty event through nothing more than a single point of failure. In April of 1911, at the Banner Mine in Alabama, an explosion tore through part of the tunnel system. On its own, that blast directly killed 7 men. 7, a tragedy, but a contained one. Except the explosion also knocked out the mine's ventilation fan, the machine responsible for pushing fresh air through miles of underground passages and pushing dangerous gases back out. Without it, a substance called black damp, essentially oxygen-depleted, unbreathable air, began silently rising and spreading through tunnels where men were still alive, still working, completely unaware that the air around them had turned lethal. By the time it was over, 121 more miners had suffocated. Men who had survived the actual explosion were killed by a fan. That's the pattern running underneath every one of these disasters, whether it's fire, flood, collapse, or gas. The initial event is rarely the whole story. It's the 20 days of drinking water off a wall. It's the 55 hours behind a handmade barricade, writing letters home. It's hundreds of pillars failing at once, or 3 dams falling like dominoes, or 7 million gallons a minute pouring through a crack in the dark, or a single fan going silent and turning breathable air into a killer no one could see coming. Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, there is no tunnel, no darkness, no rising water. But there were men, not that long ago, for whom that darkness was simply Tuesday. And the fact that you'll never have to find out how long you could survive on bark and rainwater dripping down a wall, that quiet, invisible safety, was paid for, tunnel by tunnel, by every name on this list.